Chapter 8. Of the languages of the people in the moon, of the manner of feeding there and paying the scot, and of how the author was taken to court. Thus all the comfort I had during the misery of my hard usage were the visits of this officious spirit, for you may judge what conversation I could have with these that came to see me, since besides that they only took me for an animal, in the highest class of the category of brutes, I neither understood their language nor they mine. For you must know that there are but two idioms in use in that country, one for the grandees, and another for the people in general. That of the great ones is no more but various inarticulate tones, much like to our music when the words are not added to the air. And in reality it is an invention both very useful and pleasant. For when they are weary of talking, or disdain to prostitute their throats to that office, they take either a lute or some other instrument, whereby they communicate their thoughts as well as by their tongue, so that sometimes 15 or 20 in a company will handle a point of divinity, or discuss the difficulties of a lawsuit, in the most harmonious consort that ever tickled the ear. The second, which is used by the vulgar, is performed by a shivering of the members, but not perhaps as you may imagine. For some parts of the body signify an entire discourse. For example, the agitation of a finger, a hand, an ear, a lip, an arm, an eye, a cheek. Every one severally will make up an oration, or a period with all the parts of it. Others serve only instead of words, as the knitting of the brows, the several quiverings of the muscles, the turning of the hands, the stamping of the feet, the contortion of the arm, so that when they speak, as their custom is, stark naked, their members being used to gesticulate their conceptions, move so quick that one would not think it to be a man that spoke, but a body that trembled. Every day, almost, the spirit came to see me, and his rare conversation made me patiently bear with the rigour of my captivity. At length one morning I saw a man enter my cabin, whom I knew not, who having a long while licked me gently, took me in his teeth by the shoulder, and with one of his paws, wherewith he held me up for fear I might hurt myself, threw me upon his back, where I found myself so softly seated, and so much at my ease, that, though being afflicted to be used like a beast, I had not the least desire of making my escape. And besides, these men that go upon all four are much swifter than we, seeing the heaviest of them make nothing of running down a stag. In the meantime I was extremely troubled that I had no news of my courteous spirit. And the first night we came to our inn, as I was walking in the court, expecting till supper should be ready, a pretty handsome young man came smiling in my face, and cast his 2 forelegs about my neck. After I had a little considered him, "How," said he in French, "do you not know your friend then?" I leave you to judge in what case I was at that time. Really, my surprise was so great that I began to imagine that all the globe of the moon, all that had befallen me, and all that I had seen, had only been enchantment. And that beast man, who was the same that had carried me all day, continued to speak to me in this manner: "You promised me that the good offices I did you should never be forgotten, and yet it seems you have never seen me before." But perceiving me still in amaze, "In fine," said he, "I am that same demon of Socrates, who diverted you during your imprisonment, and who, that I may still oblige you, took to myself a body, on which I carried you today." "But," said I, interrupting him, "how can that be, seeing that all day you were of a very long stature, and now you are very short; that all day long you had a weak and broken voice, and now you have a clear and vigorous one; that, in short, all day long you were a grey-headed old man, and are now a brisk young blade? Is it then that whereas in my country the progress is from life to death, animals here go retrograde from death to life, and by growing old become young again?" "As soon as I had spoken to the prince," said he, "and received orders to bring you to court, I went and found you out where you were, and have brought you hither. But the body I acted in was so tired out with the journey, that all its organs refused me their ordinary functions, so that I inquired the way to the hospital. where being come in I found the body of a young man, just then expired by a very odd accident, but yet very common in this country. I drew near him, pretending to find motion in him still, and protesting to those who were present that he was not dead, and that what they thought to be the cause of his death was no more but a bare lethargy, so that without being perceived I put my mouth to his, by which I entered as with a breath. Then down dropped my old carcass, and as if I had been that young man, I rose and came to look for you, leaving the spectators crying a miracle. With this they came to call us to supper, and I followed my guide into a parlour richly furnished, but where I found nothing fit to be eaten. No victuals appearing, when I was ready to die of hunger, made me ask him where the cloth was laid. But I could not hear what he answered, for at that instant 3 or 4 young boys, children of the house, drew near, and with much civility stripped me to the shirt. This new ceremony so astonished me, that I durst not ask my pretty valets de chamber the cause of it. And I cannot tell how my guide, who asked me what I would begin with, could draw from me these 2 words, a potage. But hardly had I pronounced them, when I smelt the odour of the most agreeable soup that ever steamed in the rich glutton's nose. I was about to rise from my place, that I might trace that delicious scent to its source, but my carrier hindered me. "Whither are you going?" said he. "We shall fetch a walk by and by, but now it is time to eat. Make an end of your potage, and then we'll have something else." "And where the devil is the potage?" answered I, half angry. "Have you laid a wager you'll jeer me all this day?" "I thought," replied he, "that at the town we came from you had seen your master or somebody else at meal, and that's the reason I told you not, how people feed in this country. Seeing then you are still ignorant, you must know that here they live on steams. The art of cookery is to shut up in great vessels, made on purpose, the exhalations that proceed from the meat whilst it is a dressing. And when they have provided enough of several sorts and several tastes, according to the appetite of those they treat, they open one vessel where that steam is kept, and after that another, and so on till the company be satisfied. Unless you have already lived after this manner, you would never think that the nose without teeth and gullet can perform the office of the mouth in feeding a man, but I'll make you experience it yourself." He had no sooner said so, but I found so many agreeable and nourishing vapours enter the parlour, one after another, that in less than half a quarter of an hour I was fully satisfied. When we were got up, "This is not a matter," said he, "much to be admired at, seeing you cannot have lived so long, and not have observed that all sorts of cooks, who eat less than people of another calling, are nevertheless much fatter. Whence proceeds that plumpness, do you think? Unless it be from the steams that continually environ them, which penetrate into their bodies and fatten them. Hence it is that the people of this world enjoy a more steady and vigorous health, by reason that their food hardly engenders any excrements, which are in a manner the original of all diseases. You were perhaps surprised that before supper you were stripped, since it is a custom not practised in your country. But it is the fashion of this, and for this end used, that the animal may be the more transpirable to the fumes." "Sir," answered I, "there is a great deal of probability in what you say, and I have found somewhat of it myself by experience. But I must frankly tell you, that not being able to unbrute myself so soon, I should be glad to feel something that my teeth might fix upon." He promised I should, but not before next day. "Because," said he, "to eat so soon after your meal would breed crudities." After we had discoursed a little longer, we went up to a chamber to take our rest. A man met us on the top of the stairs, who, having attentively eyed us, led me into a closet, where the floor was strowed with orange flowers 3 foot thick, and my spirit into another filled with gillyflowers and jessamines. Perceiving me amazed at that magnificence, he told me that they were beds of the country. In fine, we laid ourselves down to rest in our several cells, and so soon as I had stretched myself out upon my flowers, by the light of 30 large glowworms shut up in a crystal, being the only candles Caron uses, I perceived the 3 or 4 boys who had stripped me before supper, one tickling my feet, another my thighs, the third my flanks, and the fourth my arms, and all so delicately and daintily, that in less than in a minute I was fast asleep. Next morning, by sunrising, my spirit came into my room and said to me, "Now I'll be as good as my word. You shall breakfast this morning more solidly than you supped last night." With that I got up, and he led me by the hand to a place at the back of the garden, where one of the children of the house stayed for us, with a piece in his hand much like to one of our firelocks. He asked my guide if I would have a dozen of larks, because baboons, one of which he took me to be, loved to feed on them. I had hardly answered yes, when the fowler discharged a shot, and 20 or 30 larks fell at our feet, ready roasted. This, thought I presently with myself, verifies the proverb in our world, of a country where larks fall ready roasted. Without doubt it has been made by somebody that came from hence. Fall to, said my spirit, don't spare, for they have a knack of mingling a certain composition with their powder and shot, which kills, plucks, roasts, and seasons the fowl all at once. I took up some of them, and ate them upon his word. And to say the truth, in all my lifetime I never ate anything so delicious. Having thus breakfasted, we prepared to be gone, and with 1,000 odd faces, which they use when they would show their love, our landlord received a paper from my spirit. I asked him if it was a note for the reckoning. He replied, no, that all was paid, and that it was a copy of verses. How, verses? Said I. Are your innkeepers here curious of rhyme, then? It's, said he, the money of the country, and the charge we have been at here hath been computed to amount to 3 couplets or 6 verses, which I have given him. I did not fear we should outrun the constable, for though we should pamper ourselves for a whole week, we could not spend a sonnet, and I have 4 about me, besides 2 epigrams, 2 odes, and an eclogue. Would to God, said I, it were so in our world, for I know a good many honest poets there who are ready to starve, and who might live plentifully if that money would pass in payment. I farther asked him if these verses would always serve if one transcribed them. He made answer, no, and so went on, when an author has composed any, he carries them to the mint, where the sworn poets of the kingdom sit in court. There these versifying officers essay the pieces, and if they be judged sterling, they are rated not according to their coin, that's to say, that a sonnet is not always as good as a sonnet, but according to the intrinsic value of the piece, so that if any one starve, he must be a blockhead, for men of wit make always good cheer. With ecstasy I was admiring the judicious policy of that country, when he proceeded in this manner. There are others who keep public house after a far different manner. When one is about to be gone, they demand, proportionably to the charges, an acquittance for the other world. And when that is given them, they write down in a great register, which they call Doomsday's Book, much after this manner. Item, the value of so many verses, delivered such a day to such a person, which he is to pay upon the receipt of this acquittance, out of his readiest cash. And when they find themselves in danger of death, they cause these registers to be chopped in pieces, and swallow them down, because they believe that if they were not thus digested, they would be good for nothing. This conversation was no hindrance to our journey, for my 4-legged porter jogged on under me, and I rid straddling on his back. I shall not be particular in relating to you all the adventures that happened to us on our way, till we arrived at length at the town where the king holds his residence. End of chapter 8. Chapter 9. Of the little Spaniard whom he met there, and of his quaint wit, of vacuum, specific weights, and sundry other philosophical matters. I was no sooner come, but they carried me to the palace, where the grandees received me with more moderation than the people had done as I passed the streets. But both great and small concluded that without doubt I was the female of the Queen's little animal. My guide was my interpreter, and yet he himself understood not the riddle, and knew not what to make of that little animal of the Queen's. But we were soon satisfied as to that, for the king, having some time considered me, ordered it to be brought, and about half an hour after I saw a company of apes, wearing ruffs and breeches, come in, and amongst them a little man, almost of my own build, for he went on 2 legs. So soon as he perceived me, he accosted me with a criado de vuestra merced. I answered his greeting much in the same terms, but alas, no sooner had they seen us talk together, but they believed their conjecture to be true. And so indeed it seemed, for he of all the bystanders, that passed the most favourable judgment upon us, protested that our conversation was a chattering we kept for joy at our meeting again. That little man told me that he was an European, a native of old Castile, that he had found a means by the help of birds to mount up to the world of the moon, where then we were, that falling into the Queen's hands, she had taken him for a monkey, because fate would have it so, that in that country they clothe apes in a Spanish dress, and that upon his arrival, being found in that habit, she had made no doubt but he was of the same kind. It could not otherwise be, replied I, but having tried all fashions of apparel upon them, none were found so ridiculous, and by consequence more becoming a kind of animals which are only entertained for pleasure and diversion. That shows you little understand the dignity of our nation, answered he, for whom the universe breeds men only to be our slaves, and nature produces nothing but objects of mirth and laughter. He then entreated me to tell him how I durst be so bold as to scale the moon with the machine I told him of. I answered that it was because he had carried away the birds, which I intended to have made use of. He smiled at this raillery, and about a quarter of an hour after, the king commanded the keeper of the monkeys to carry us back. The king's pleasure was punctually obeyed, at which I was very glad, for the satisfaction I had of having a mate to converse with during the solitude of my brutification. One day my male, for I was taken for the female, told me that the true reason which had obliged him to travel all over the earth, and at length to abandon it for the moon, was that he could not find so much as one country where even imagination was at liberty. Look ye, said he, how the wittiest thing you can say, unless you wear a cornered cap, if it thwart the principles of the doctors of the robe, you are an idiot, a fool, and something worse perhaps. I was about to have been put into the Inquisition at home for maintaining to the pedant's teeth that there was a vacuum, and that I knew no one matter in the world more ponderous than another. I asked him what probable arguments he had to confirm so new an opinion. To evince that, answered he, you must suppose that there is but one element, for though we see water, earth, air, and fire distinct, yet are they never found to be so perfectly pure, but that there still remains some mixture. For example, when you behold fire, it is not fire, but air much extended. The air is but water much dilated. Water is but liquefied earth, and the earth itself but condensed water. And thus, if you weigh matter seriously, you'll find it is but one, which like an excellent comedian here below acts all parts, in all sorts of dresses. Otherwise we must admit as many elements as there are kinds of bodies. And if you ask me why fire burns, and water cools, since it is but one and the same matter, I answer, that that matter acts by sympathy, according to the disposition it is in at the time when it acts. Fire, which is nothing but earth also, more dilated than is fit for the constitution of air, strives to change into itself, by sympathy, whatever it meets with. Thus the heat of coals, being the most subtle fire, and most proper to penetrate a body, at first slides through the pores of our skin, and because it is a new matter that fills us, it makes us exhale in sweat. That sweat dilated by the fire is converted to a steam, and becomes air, that air being further rarefied by the heat of the antiperistasis, or of the neighbouring stars, is called fire, and the earth, abandoned by the cold and humidity which were ligaments to the whole, falls to the ground. Water, on the other hand, though it no ways differ from the matter of fire, but in that it is closer, burns us not. Because that being dense by sympathy, it closes up the bodies it meets with, and the cold we feel is no more but the effect of our flesh contracting itself, because of the vicinity of earth or water, which constrains it to a resemblance. Hence it is, that those who are troubled with a dropsy convert all their nourishment into water, and the choleric convert all the blood that is formed in their liver into choler. It being then supposed that there is but one element, it is most certain that all bodies, according to their several qualities, incline equally towards the centre of the earth. But you'll ask me, why then does iron, metal, earth, and wood descend more swiftly to the centre than a sponge, if it be not that it is full of air which naturally tends upwards? That is not at all the reason, and thus I make it out. Though a rock fall with greater rapidity than a feather, both of them have the same inclination for the journey. But a cannon bullet, for instance, were the earth pierced through, would precipitate with greater haste to the centre thereof than a bladder full of wind. And the reason is, because that mass of metal is a great deal of earth contracted into a little space, and that wind a very little earth in a large space. For all the parts of matter, being so closely joined together in the iron, increase their force by their union, because being thus compacted, they are many that fight against a few, seeing a parcel of air equal to the bullet in bigness is not equal in quantity. Not to insist on a long deduction of arguments to prove this, tell me in good earnest how a pike, a sword, or a dagger wounds us. If it be not because the steel, being a matter wherein the parts are more continuous and more closely knit together than your flesh is, whose pores and softness show that it contains but very little matter within a great extent of place, and that the point of the steel that pricks us, being almost an innumerable number of particles of matter against a very little flesh, it forces it to yield to the stronger, in the same manner as a squadron in close order will easily break through a more open battalion. For why does a bit of red-hot iron burn more than a log of wood all on fire, unless it be that in the iron there is more fire in a small space, seeing it adheres to all the parts of the metal, than in the wood, which being very spongy by consequence contains a great deal of vacuity, and that vacuity, being but a privation of being, cannot receive the form of fire. But you'll object, you suppose a vacuum, as if you had proved it, and that's begging of the question. Well, then I'll prove it, and though that difficulty be the sister of the Gordian knot, yet my arms are strong enough to become its Alexander. Let that vulgar beast, then, who does not think itself a man, had it not been told so, answer me if it can. Suppose now there be but one matter, as I think I have sufficiently proved, whence comes it, that according to its appetite it enlarges or contracts itself? Whence is it that a piece of earth by being condensed becomes a stone? Is it that the parts of that stone are placed one with another, in such a manner that wherever that grain of sand is settled, even there, or in the same point, another grain of sand is lodged? That cannot be, no, not according to their own principles, seeing there is no penetration of bodies. But that matter must have crowded together, and, if you will, abridged itself, so that it hath filled some place which was empty before. To say that it is incomprehensible, that there should be a nothing in the world, that we are in part made up of nothing. Why not, pray? Is not the whole world wrapped up in nothing? Since you yield me this point, then confess ingeniously that it's as rational that the world should have a nothing within it as nothing about it. I well perceive you'll put the question to me, why water compressed in a vessel by the frost should break it, if it be not to hinder a vacuity. But I answer, that only happens because the air overhead, which as well as earth and water tends to the centre, meeting with an empty tun by the way, takes tip his lodging there. If it find the pores of that vessel, that's to say, the ways that lead to that void place, too narrow, too long, and too crooked, with impatience it breaks through and arrives at its tun. But not to trifle away time, in answering all their objections, I dare be bold to say, that if there were no vacuity, there could be no motion, or else a penetration of bodies must be admitted. For it would be a little too ridiculous to think that when a gnat pushes back a parcel of air with its wings, that parcel drives another before it, and that other another still, and that so the stirring of the little toe of a flea should raise a bunch upon the back of the universe. When they are at a stand, they have recourse to rarefaction. But, in good earnest, how can it be, when a body is rarefied, that one particle of the mass does recede from another particle, without leaving an empty space betwixt them? Must not the two bodies, which are just separated, have been at the same time in the same place of this? And that so, they must have all three penetrated each other. I expect you'll ask me, why through a reed, a syringe, or a pump, water is forced to ascend contrary to its inclination? To which I answer, that that's by violence, and that it is not the fear of a vacuity that turns it out of the right way, but that being linked to the air by an imperceptible chain, it rises when the air, to which it is joined, is rarefied. That's no such knotty difficulty, when one knows the perfect circle, and the delicate concatenation of the elements. For if you attentively consider the slime which joins the earth and water together in marriage, you'll find that it is neither earth nor water, but the mediator betwixt these two enemies. In the same manner the water and air reciprocally send a mist, that dives into the humours of both, to negotiate a peace betwixt them, and the air is reconciled to the fire by means of an interposing exhalation which unites them. I believe he would have proceeded in his discourse, had they not brought us our victuals, and seeing we were hungry, I stopped my ears to his discourse, and opened my stomach to the food they gave us. I remember another time, when we were upon our philosophy, for neither of us took pleasure to discourse of mean things. I am vexed, said he, to see a wit of your stamp infected with the errors of the vulgar. You must know then, in spite of the pedantry of Aristotle with which your schools in France still ring, that everything is in everything. That's to say, for instance, that in the water there is fire, in the fire water, in the air earth, and in the earth air. Though that opinion makes scholars open their eyes as big as saucers, yet it is easier to prove it than persuade it. For I ask them, in the first place, if water does not breed filth. If they deny it, let them dig a pit, fill it with mere element, and to prevent all blind objections, let them, if they please, strain it through a strainer, and I'll oblige myself, in case they find no filth therein within a certain time, to drink up all the water they have poured into it. But if they find filth, as I make no doubt on't, it is a convincing argument that there is both salt and fire there. Consequentially now, to find water in fire, I take it to be no difficult task. For let them choose fire, even that which is most abstracted from matter, as comets are, there is a great deal in them still, seeing if that unctuous humour whereof they are engendered, being reduced to a sulphur by the heat of the antiperistasis which kindles them, did not find a curb of its violence in the humid cold that qualifies and resists it, it would spend itself in a trice like lightning. Now, that there is air in the earth, they will not deny it, or otherwise they have never heard of the terrible earthquakes that have so often shaken the mountains of Sicily. Besides, the earth is full of pores, even to the least grains of sand that compose it. Nevertheless, no man hath as yet said that these hollows were filled with vacuity. It will not be taken amiss then, I hope, if the air takes up its quarters there. It remains to be proved that there is earth in the air, but I think it scarcely worth my pains, seeing you are convinced of it, as often as you see such numberless legions of atoms fall upon your heads, as even stifle arithmetic. But let us pass from simple to compound bodies, they'll furnish me with much more frequent subjects, and to demonstrate that all things are in all things, not that they change into one another, as your peripatetics juggle. For I will maintain to their teeth, that the principles mingle, separate, and mingle again in such a manner, that hath been made water by the wise Creator of the world will always be water. I shall suppose no maxim, as they do, but what I prove. And therefore take a billet or any other combustible stuff, and set fire to it. They'll say, when it is in a flame, that what was wood is now become fire. But I maintain the contrary, and that there is no more fire in it, when it is all in flame, than before it was kindled. But that which before was hid in the billet, and by the humidity and cold hindered from acting, being now assisted by the stranger, hath rallied its forces against the phlegm that choked it, and commanding the field of battle, that was possessed by its enemy, triumphs over his jailer and appears without fetters. Don't you see how the water flees out at the two ends of the billet, hot and smoking from the fight it was engaged in? That flame which you see rise on high is the purer fire, unpestered from the matter, and by consequence the readiest to return home to itself. Nevertheless it unites itself by tapering into a pyramid, till it rise to a certain height, that it may pierce through the thick humidity of the air which resists it. But as mounting it disengaged itself by little and little from the violent company of its landlords, so it diffuses itself, because then it meets with nothing that thwarts its passage, which negligence, though, is many times the cause of a second captivity. For marching stragglingly, it wanders sometimes into a cloud, and if it meet there with a party of its own sufficient to make head against a vapour, they engage, grumble, thunder and roar, and the death of innocence is many times the effect of the animated rage of those inanimated things. If, when it finds itself pestered among those crudities of the middle region, it is not strong enough to make a defence, it yields to its enemy upon discretion, which by its weight constrains it to fall again to the earth. And this wretch, enclosed in a drop of rain, may perhaps fall at the foot of an oak, whose animal fire will invite the poor straggler to take a lodging with him. And thus you have it, in the same condition again as it was a few days before. But let us trace the fortune of the other elements that composed that billet. The air retreats to its own quarters also, though blended with vapours, because the fire, all in a rage, drove them briskly out pell-mell together. Now you have it serving the winds for a tennis ball, furnishing breath to animals, filling up the vacuities that nature hath left. And it may be also wrapped up in a drop of dew, suckling the thirsty leaves of that tree whither our fire retreated. The water driven from its throne by the flame, being by the heat elevated to the nursery of the meteors, will distill again in rain upon our oak, as soon as upon another. And the earth being turned to ashes, and then cured of its sterility, either by the nourishing heat of a dunghill on which it hath been thrown, or by the vegetative salt of some neighbouring plants, or by the teeming waters of some rivers, may happen also to be near this oak, which by the heat of its germ will attract it, and convert it into a part of its bulk. In this manner these four elements undergo the same destiny, and return to the same state which they quitted but a few days before. So that it may be said that all that's necessary for the composition of a tree is in a man, and in a tree all that's necessary for making of a man. In fine, according to this way, all things will be found in all things. But we want a Prometheus, to pluck us out of the bosom of nature and render us sensible, which I am willing to call the first matter. These were the things, I think, with which we passed the time, for that little Spaniard had a quaint wit. Our conversation, however, was only in the night time, because from 6 o'clock in the morning until night, crowds of the people that came to stare at us in our lodging would have disturbed us, for some threw us stones, others nuts, and others grass. There was no talk but of the king's beasts. We had our victuals daily at set hours. I cannot tell whether it was that I minded their gestures and tones more than my mail did, but I learned sooner than he to understand their language, and to smatter a little of it, which made us to be looked upon in another guess manner than formerly. And the news thereupon flew presently all over the kingdom, that 2 wild men had been found, who were less than other men, by reason of the bad food we had had in the deserts, and who through a defect of their parents' seed had not the forelegs strong enough to support their bodies. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10, where the author comes in doubt whether he be a man, an ape, or an ostrich, and of the opinion of the lunar philosophers concerning Aristotle. This belief would have taken rooting by being spread, had it not been for the learned men of the country who opposed it, saying that it was horrid impiety to believe not only beasts but monsters to be of their kind. It would be far more probable, added the calmer sort, that our domestic beasts should participate of the privilege of humanity, and by consequence of immortality, as being bred in our country, than a monstrous beast that talks of being born I know not where, in the moon. And then observe the difference betwixt us and them. We walk upon 4 feet because God would not trust so precious a thing upon weaker supporters, and he was afraid lest marching otherwise some mischance might befall man. And therefore he took the pains to rest him upon 4 pillars, that he might not fall, but disdaining to have a hand in the fabric of these 2 brutes, he left them to the caprice of nature, who, not concerning herself with the loss of so small a matter, supported them only by 2 feet. Birds themselves, said they, have not had so hard measure as they. For they have got feathers at least, to supply the weakness of their legs, and to cast themselves in the air when we pursue them, whereas nature, depriving these monsters of 2 legs, hath disabled them from scaping our justice. Besides, consider a little how they have the head raised toward heaven. It is because God would punish them with scarcity of all things, that he hath so placed them. For that supplicant posture shows that they complain to heaven of him that created them, and that they beg permission to make their best of our leavings. But we, on the contrary, have the head bending downwards, to behold the blessings whereof we are the masters, and as if there were nothing in heaven that our happy condition needed envy. I heard such discourses or the like daily at my lodge, and at length they so curbed the minds of the people as to that point, that it was decreed, that at best I should only pass for a parrot without feathers, for they confirmed those who were already persuaded, in that I had but 2 legs no more than a bird, which was the cause that I was put into a cage by express orders from the Privy Council. There the Queen's bird-keeper, taking the pains daily to teach me to whistle, as they do stares or singing birds here, I was really happy in that I wanted not food. In the meanwhile, with the sonnets the spectators stunned me with, I learnt to speak as they did, so that when I was got to be so much master of the idiom as to express most of my thoughts, I told them the finest of my conceits. The quaintness of my sayings was already the entertainment of all societies, and my wit was so much esteemed that the council was obliged to publish an edict, forbidding all people to believe that I was endowed with reason, with express commands to all persons, of what quality or condition soever, not to imagine but that whatever I did, though never so wittily, proceeded only from instinct. Nevertheless, the decision of what I was divided the town into 2 factions. The party that stood for me increased daily, and at length, in spite of the anathema whereby they endeavoured to scare the multitude, they who held for me demanded a convention of the states for determining that controversy. It was long before they could agree in the choice of those who should have a vote, but the arbitrators pacified the heat by making the number of both parties equal, who ordered that I should be brought unto the assembly as I was. But I was treated there with all imaginable severity. My examiners, amongst other things, put questions of philosophy to me. I ingenuously told them all that my tutor had heretofore taught me, but they easily refuted me by more convincing arguments. So that, having nothing to answer for myself, my last refuge was to principles of Aristotle, which stood me in as little stead as his sophisms did, for in 2 words they let me see the falsity of them. That same Aristotle, said they, whose learning you brag so much of, did without doubt accommodate principles to his philosophy, instead of accommodating his philosophy to principles. And besides, he ought to have proved them at least to be more rational than those of the other sects you mentioned to us. Wherefore the good man will not take it ill, we hope, if we bid him God BW. In fine, when they perceived that I did nothing but bawl, that they were not more knowing than Aristotle, and that I was forbid to dispute against those who denied his principles, they all unanimously concluded that I was not a man, but perhaps a kind of ostrich, seeing I carried my head upright like them, that I walked on 2 legs, and that in short, but for a little down, I was every way like one of them, so that the bird-keeper was ordered to have me back to my cage. I spent my time pretty pleasantly there, for because I had correctly learnt their language, the whole court took pleasure to make me prattle. The queen's maids, among the rest, slipped always some boon into my basket, and the gentlest of them all, having conceived some kindness for me, was so transported with joy, when in private I entertained her with the manners and divertissements of the people of our world, and especially our bells, and other instruments of music, that she protested to me, with tears in her eyes, that if ever I found myself in a condition to fly back again to our world, she would follow me with all her heart. End of chapter 10. Chapter 11. Of the manner of making war in the moon, and of how the moon is not the moon, nor the earth. One morning early, having started out of my sleep, I found her taboring upon the grates of my cage. "Take good heart," said she to me, "yesterday in council a war was resolved upon against the king. I hope that during the hurry of preparations, whilst our monarch and his subjects are absent, I may find an occasion to make your escape." "How, a war?" said I, interrupting her. "Have the princes of this world then any quarrels amongst themselves, as those of ours have? Good now, let me know their way of fighting." "When the arbitrators," replied she, "who are freely chosen by the two parties, have appointed the time for raising forces for their march, the number of combatants, the day and place of battle, and all with so great equality, that there is not one man more in one army than in the other, all the maimed soldiers on the one side are lifted in one company, and when they come to engage, the Maréchal de Camp take care to expose them to the maimed of the other side. The giants are matched with colosses, the fencers with those that can handle their weapons, the valiant with the stout, the weak with the infirm, the sick with the indisposed, the sturdy with the strong. And if any undertake to strike at another than the enemy he is matched with, unless he can make it out that it was by mistake, he is condemned for a coward. When the battle is over, they take an account of the wounded, the dead, and the prisoners, for runaways they have none, and if the loss be equal on both sides, they draw cuts, who shall be proclaimed victorious. But though a kingdom hath defeated the enemy in open war, yet there is hardly anything got by it. For there are other smaller armies of learned and witty men, on whose disputations the triumph or servitude of states wholly depends. One learned man grapples with another, one wit with another, and one judicious man with another judicious man. Now the triumph which a state gains in this manner is reckoned as good as 3 victories by open force. After the proclamation of victory, the assembly is broken up, and the victorious people either choose the enemy's king to be theirs, or confirm their own. I could not forbear to laugh at this scrupulous way of giving battle, and for an example of much stronger politics, I alleged the customs of our Europe, where the monarch would be sure not to let slip any favourable occasion of gaining the day. But mind what she said as to that. "Tell me, pray, if your princes use not a pretext of right when they levy arms?" "No doubt," answered I, "and of the justice of their cause too." "Why then," replied she, "do they not choose impartial and unsuspected arbitrators to compose their differences? And if it be found that the one has as much right as the other, let things continue as they were, or let them play a game at picket for the town or province that's in dispute." "But why all these circumstances," replied I, "in your way of fighting? Is it not enough that both armies are equal in the number of men?" "Your judgment is weak," answered she. "Would you think in conscience that if you had the better of your enemy, hand to hand, in an open field, you had fairly overcome him, if you had had on a coat of mail and he none? If he had had but a dagger, and you a tuck? And in a word, if he had had but one arm, and you both yours? Nevertheless, what equality soever you may recommend to your gladiators, they never fight on even terms. For the one will be a tall man, and the other short; the one skilful at his weapon, and the other a man that never handled a sword. The one will be strong, and the other weak. And though these disproportions were not, but that the one were as skilful and strong as the other, yet still they might not be rightly matched, for one perhaps may have more courage than the other, who being rash and hot-headed, inconcerned in danger, as not foreseeing it; of a bilious temper, a more contracted heart, with all the qualities that constitute courage, as if that as well as a sword were not a weapon which his adversary hath not. He makes nothing of falling desperately upon, terrifying and killing this poor man, who foresees the danger, who has his heat choked in phlegm, and a heart too wide to close in the spirits in such a posture as is necessary for thawing that ice which is called cowardice. And now you praise that man for having killed his enemy at odds, and praising him for his boldness, you praise him for a sin against nature, seeing such boldness tends to its destruction. And this puts me in mind to tell ye, that some years ago application was made to the Council of War for a more circumspect and conscientious rule to be made as to the way of fighting. The philosopher who gave the advice, if I mistake it not, spake in this manner: You imagine, gentlemen, that you have very equally balanced the advantages of two enemies, when you have chosen both tall men, both skilful, and both courageous. But that's not enough, seeing after all the conqueror must have the better on't, either through his skill, strength, or good fortune. If it be by skill, without doubt he hath taken his adversary on the blind side, which he did not expect, or struck him sooner than was likely, or feigning to make his pass on one side, he hath attacked him on the other. Nevertheless, all this is cunning, cheating, and treachery, and none of these make a brave man. If he hath triumphed by force, would you judge his enemy overcome, because he hath been overpowered? No. Doubtless, no more than you'll say that a man hath lost the victory, when, overwhelmed by a mountain, it was not in his power to gain it. Even so, the other was not overcome, because he was not in a suitable disposition, at that nick of time, to resist the violences of his adversary. If chance hath given him the better of his enemy, fortune ought then to be crowned, since he hath contributed nothing to it. And in fine, the vanquished is no more to be blamed than he who at dice, having thrown 17, is beat by another that throws 3 sixes. They confessed he was in the right, but that it was impossible, according to humane appearances, to remedy it, and that it was better to submit to a small inconvenience than to open a door to 100 of greater importance. She entertained me no longer at that time, because she was afraid to be found alone with me so early. Not that impudicity is a crime in that country. On the contrary, except malefactors convicted, all men have power over all women. And in the same manner a woman may bring her action against a man for refusing her. But she durst not keep me company publicly, because the members of council at their last meeting had said that it was chiefly the women who gave it out that I was a man, which was the reason that for a long time I neither saw her nor any other of her sex. In the meantime, some must needs have revived the disputes about the definition of my being, for whilst I was thinking of nothing else but of dying in my cage, I was once more brought out to have another audience. I was then questioned in presence of a great many courtiers upon some points of natural philosophy, and as I take it, my answers gave some kind of satisfaction, for the President declared to me at large his thoughts concerning the structure of the world. They seemed to me very ingenious, and had he not traced it to its original, which he maintained to be eternal, I should have thought his philosophy more rational than our own. But as soon as I heard him maintain a foppery so contrary to our faith, I broke with him, at which he did but laugh, and that obliged me to tell him, that since they were thereabouts with it, I began again to think that their world was but a moon. But then all cried, Don't you see here earth, rivers, seas? What's all that then? No matter, said I, Aristotle assures us it is but a moon. And if you had said the contrary in the schools, where I have been bred, you would have been hissed at. At this they all burst out in laughter. You need not ask if it was their ignorance that made them do so, for in the meantime I was carried back to my cage. But some more passionate doctors, being informed that I had the boldness to affirm that the moon from whence I came was a world, and that their world was no more but a moon, thought it might give them a very just pretext to have me condemned to the water, for that's their way of rooting out heretics. For that end they went in a body and complained to the king, who promised them justice, and ordered me once more to be brought to the bar. Now was I the 3rd time uncaged, and then the most ancient spoke and pleaded against me. I do not well remember his speech, because I was too much frighted to receive the tones of his voice without disorder, and because also in declaiming he made use of an instrument which stunned me with its noise. It was a speaking trumpet, which he had chosen on purpose that by its martial sound he might rouse them to my death. and by that emotion of their spirits hinder reason from performing its office. As it happens in our armies, where the noise of drums and trumpets hinders the soldiers from minding the importance of their lives. When he had done, I rose up to defend my cause, but I was excused from it by an accident that will surprise you. Just as I had opened my mouth, a man, who with much ado had pressed through the crowd, fell at the king's feet, and a long while rolled himself upon his back in his presence. This practice did not at all surprise me, because I knew it to be the posture they put themselves into when they have a mind to be heard in public. I only stopped my own harangue and gave ear to his. "Just judges," said he, "listen to me. You cannot condemn that man, that monkey or parrot, for saying that the moon from whence he comes is a world, for if he be a man, though he were not come from the moon, since all men are free, is not he free also to imagine what he pleases? How can you constrain him not to have visions, as well as you? You may very well force him to say that the moon is not a world, but he will not believe it for all that. For to believe a thing, some possibilities inclining more to the yea than to the nay must offer to one's imagination. And unless you furnish him that probability, or his own mind hit upon it, he may very well tell you what he believes, but still remain an infidel. I am now to prove that he ought not to be condemned if you lift him in the catalogue of the beasts. For suppose him to be an animal without reason, would it be rational in you to condemn him for offending against it? He hath said that the moon is a world. Now beasts act only by the instinct of nature. It is nature then that says so, and not he. To think that wise nature, who hath made the world and the moon, knows not herself what it is, and that ye who have no more knowledge but what ye derive from her should more certainly know it, would be very ridiculous. But if passion should make you renounce your principles, and you should suppose that nature does not guide beasts, blush at least to think on't, that the caprices of a beast should so discompose you. Really, gentlemen, should you meet with a man come to the years of discretion, who made it his business to inspect the government of pismires, giving a blow to one that had overthrown its companion, imprisoning another that had robbed its neighbour of a grain of corn, and indicting a third for leaving its eggs, would you not think him a madman to be employed in things so far below him, and to pretend to give laws to animals that never had reason? How will you then, most venerable assembly, justify yourselves for being so concerned at the caprices of that little animal? Just judges, I have no more to say. When he had made an end, all the hall rung again with a kind of musical applause, and after all the opinions had been canvassed, during the space of a large quarter of an hour, the king gave sentence, that for the future I should be reputed to be a man, accordingly set at liberty, and that the punishment of being drowned should be converted into a public disgrace, the most honourable way of satisfying the law in that country, whereby I should be obliged to retract openly what I had maintained in saying that the moon was a world, because of the scandal that the novelty of that opinion might give to weak brethren. This sentence being pronounced, I was taken away out of the palace, richly clothed, but in derision, carried in a magnificent chariot, as on a tribunal, which 4 princes in harness drew. And in all the public places of the town, I was forced to make this declaration: Good people, I declare to you that this moon here is not a moon, but a world, and that the world below is not a world, but a moon. This the council thinks fit you should believe. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12. Of a philosophical entertainment. After I had proclaimed this, in the 5 great places of the town, my advocate came and reached me his hand to help me down. I was in great amaze, when after I had eyed him, I found him to be my spirit. We were an hour in embracing one another. Come, lodge with me, said he, for if you return to court after a public disgrace, you will not be well looked upon. Nay, more, I must tell you, that you would have been still amongst the apes yonder, as well as the Spaniard your companion, if I had not in all companies published the vigour and force of your wit, and gained from your enemies the protection of the great men in your favours. I ceased not to thank him all the way, till we came to his lodgings. There he entertained me till supper time with all the engines he had set a work to prevail with my enemies, notwithstanding the most specious pretexts they had used for riding the mobile, to desist from so unjust a prosecution. But as they came to acquaint us that supper was upon the table, he told me that to bear me company that evening he had invited 2 professors of the university of the town to sup with him. "I'll make them," said he, "fall upon the philosophy which they teach in this world, and by that means you shall see my landlord's son. He's as witty a youth as ever I met with. He would prove another Socrates, if he could use his parts aright, and not bury in vice the graces wherewith God continually visits him by affecting a libertinism, as he does, out of a chimerical ostentation and affectation of the name of a wit. I have taken lodgings here, that I may lay hold on all opportunities of instructing him." He said no more, that he might give me the liberty to speak, if I had a mind to it, and then made a sign that they should strip me of my disgraceful ornaments, in which I still glistered. The 2 professors, whom we expected, entered just as I was undressed, and we went to sit down to table, where the cloth was laid, and where we found the youth he had mentioned to me fallen to already. They made him a low reverence, and treated him with as much respect as a slave does his lord. I asked my spirit the reason of that, who made me answer that it was because of his age, seeing in that world the aged rendered all kind of respect and deference to the young, and, which is far more, that the parents obeyed their children, so soon as by the judgment of the Senate of Philosophers they had attained to the years of discretion. "You are amazed," continued he, "at a custom so contrary to that of your country. But it is not all repugnant to reason. For say, in your conscience, when a brisk young man is at his prime in imagining, judging, and acting, is not he fitter to govern a family than a decrepit piece of 60 years, dull and doting, whose imagination is frozen under the snow of 60 winters, who follows no other guide but what you call the experience of happy successors, which are no more but the bare effects of chance, against all the rules and economy of humane prudence? And as for judgment, he hath but little of that neither, though the people of your world make it the portion of old age. But to undeceive them they must know, that that which is called prudence in an old man is no more but a panic apprehension, and a mad fear of acting any thing where there is danger, so that, when he does not run a risk wherein a young man hath lost himself, it is not that he foresaw the catastrophe, but because he had not fire enough to kindle those noble flashes which make us dare. Whereas the boldness of that young man was as a pledge of the good success of his design, because the same ardour that speeds and facilitates the execution thrust him upon the undertaking. As for execution, I should wrong your judgment if I endeavoured to convince it by proofs. You know that youth alone is proper for action. And were you not fully persuaded of this, tell me, pray, when you respect a man of courage, is it not because he can revenge you on your enemies or oppressors? And does any thing but mere habit make you consider him, when a battalion of 70 Januaries hath frozen his blood and chilled all the noble heats that youth is warmed with? When you yield to the stronger, is it not that he should be obliged to you for a victory which you cannot dispute him? Why then should you submit to him, when laziness has softened his muscles, weakened his arteries, evaporated his spirits, and sucked the marrow out of his bones? If you adore a woman, is it not because of her beauty? Why should you then continue your cringes, when old age hath made her a ghost, which only represents a hideous picture of death? In short, when you loved a witty man, it was because by the quickness of his apprehension he unravelled an intricate affair, seasoned the choicest companies with his quaint sayings, and sounded the depth of sciences with a single thought. And do you still honour him, when his worn organs disappoint his weak noddle, when he is become dull and uneasy in company, and when he looks like an aged fairy rather than a rational man? Conclude then from thence, son, that it is fitter young men should govern families than old, and the rather that, according to your own principles, Hercules, Achilles, Epaminondas, Alexander, and Caesar, of whom most part died under 40 years of age, could have merited no honours, as being too young in your account, though their youth was the only cause of their famous actions, which a more advanced age would have rendered ineffectual, as wanting that heat and promptitude that rendered them so highly successful. But you'll tell me that all the laws of your world do carefully enjoin the respect that is due to old men. That's true, but it is as true also that all who made laws have been old men, who feared that young men might justly have dispossessed them of the authority they had usurped. You owe nothing to your mortal architector but your body only. Your soul comes from heaven, and chance might have made your father your son, as now you are his. Nay, are you sure he hath not hindered you from inheriting a crown? Your spirit left heaven, perhaps with a design to animate the king of the Romans, in the womb of the empress. It casually encountered the embryo of you, by the way, and it may be to shorten its journey, went and lodged there. No, no, God would never have raised your name out of the list of mankind, though your father had died a child. But who knows whether you might not have been at this day the work of some valiant captain, that would have associated you to his glory, as well as to his estate? So that, perhaps, you are no more indebted to your father, for the life he hath given you, than you would be to a pirate who had put you in chains, because he feeds you. Nay, grant he had begot you a prince or king, a present loses its merit when it is made without the option of him who receives it. Caesar was killed, and so was Cassius too. In the meantime Cassius was obliged to the slave, from whom he begged his death, but so was not Caesar to his murderers, who forced it upon him. Did your father consult your will and pleasure when he embraced your mother? Did he ask you if you thought fit to see that age, or to wait for another? If you would be satisfied to be the son of a sot, or if you had the ambition to spring from a brave man? Alas, you whom alone the business concerned were the only person not consulted in the case. Maybe, then, had you been shut up anywhere else than in the womb of nature's ideas, and had your birth been in your own opinion, you would have said to the Parker, "My dear lady, take another spindle in your hand. I have lain very long in the bed of nothing, and I had rather continue 100 years still without a being than to be today, that I may repent of it tomorrow." However, be you must. It was to no purpose for you to whimper and squall to be taken back again to the long and darksome house they drew you out of. They made as if they believed you cried for the teat. These are the reasons, at least some of them, my son, why parents bear so much respect to their children. I know very well that I have inclined to the children's side more than in justice I ought, and that in favour of them I have spoken a little against my conscience. But since I was willing to repress the pride of some parents, who insult over the weakness of their little ones, I have been forced to do as they do who, to make a crooked tree straight, bend it to the contrary side, that between two conversions it may become even. Thus I have made fathers restore to their children what they have taken from them, by taking from them a great deal that belonged to them, that so another time they may be content with their own. I know very well also that by this apology I have offended all old men, but let them remember that they were children before they were fathers, and young before they were old, and that I must needs have spoken a great deal to their advantage, seeing they were not found in a parsley bed. But in fine, fall back, fall edge. Though my enemies draw up against my friends, it will go well enough still with me, for I have obliged all men, and only disobliged but one half. With that he held his tongue, and our landlord's son spoke in this manner. Give me leave, said he to him, since by your care I am informed of the original, history, customs, and philosophy of the world of this little man, to add something to what you have said, and to prove that children are not obliged to parents for their generation, because their parents were obliged in conscience to procreate them. The strictest philosophy of their world acknowledges that it is better to die, since to die one must have lived, than not to have had a being. Now, seeing, by not giving a being to that nothing, I leave it in a state worse than death, I am more guilty in not producing than in killing it. In the meantime, my little man, thou wouldst think thou hadst committed an unpardonable parricide shouldst thou have cut thy son's throat. It would indeed be an enormous crime, but it is far more execrable not to give a being to that which is capable of receiving it. For that child, whom thou deprivest of life forever, hath had the satisfaction of having enjoyed it for some time. Besides, we know that it is but deprived of it, but for some ages. But these 40 poor little nothings, which thou mightest have made 40 good soldiers for the king, Thou art so malicious as to deny them life, and lettest them corrupt in thy reigns, to the danger of an apoplexy, which will stifle thee. This philosophy did not at all please me, which made me 3 or 4 times shake my head. But our preceptor held his tongue, because supper was mad to be gone. We laid ourselves along, then, upon very soft quilts covered with large carpets, and a young man that waited on us, taking the oldest of our philosophers, led him into a little parlour apart, where my spirit called to him to come back to us as soon as he had supped. This humour of eating separately gave me the curiosity of asking the cause of it. He'll not relish, said he, the steam of meat, nor yet of herbs, unless they die of themselves, because he thinks they are sensible of pain. I wonder not so much, replied I, that he abstains from flesh, and all things that have had a sensitive life. For in our world the Pythagoreans, and even some holy anchorites, have followed that rule, but not to dare, for instance, cut a cabbage, for fear of hurting it. That seems to me altogether ridiculous. And for my part, answered my spirit, I find a great deal of probability in his opinion. For tell me, is not that cabbage you speak of a being existent in nature as well as you? Is not she the common mother of you both? Yet the opinion that nature is kinder to mankind than to cabbage kind tickles and makes us laugh. But seeing she is incapable of passion, she can neither love nor hate anything. And were she susceptible of love, she would rather bestow her affection upon this cabbage, which you grant cannot offend her, than upon that man who would destroy her if it lay in his power. And moreover, man cannot be born innocent, being a part of the first offender. But we know very well that the first cabbage did not offend its creator. If it be said that we are made after the image of the Supreme Being, and so is not the cabbage, grant that to be true. Yet by polluting our soul, wherein we resembled him, we have effaced that likeness, seeing nothing is more contrary to God than sin. If then our soul be no longer his image, we resemble him no more in our feet, hands, mouth, forehead, and ears, than a cabbage in its leaves, flowers, stalk, pith, and head. Do not you really think that if this poor plant could speak, when one cuts it, it would not say, "Dear brother man, what have I done to thee that deserves death? I never grow but in gardens, and am never to be found in desert places, where I might live in security. I disdain all other company but thine. And scarcely am I sowed in thy garden, when to show thee my goodwill, I blow, stretch out my arms to thee, to offer thee my children in grain. And as a requital for my civility, thou causest my head to be chopped off." Thus would a cabbage discourse if it could speak. Well, and because it cannot complain, may we therefore justly do it all the wrong which it cannot hinder? If I find a wretch bound hand and foot, may I lawfully kill him because he cannot defend himself? So far from that his weakness would aggravate my cruelty. And though this wretched creature be poor, and destitute of all the advantages which we have, yet it deserves not death. And when of all the benefits of a being it hath only that of increase, we ought not cruelly to snatch that away from it. To massacre a man is not so great sin as to cut and kill a cabbage, because one day the man will rise again, but the cabbage has no other life to hope for. By putting to death a cabbage you annihilate it, but in killing a man you make him only change his habitations. Nay, I'll go farther with you still. Since God doth equally cherish all his works, and hath equally divided the benefits betwixt us and plants, it is but just we should have an equal esteem for them as for ourselves. It is true we were born first, but in the family of God there is no birthright. If then the cabbage share not with us in the inheritance of immortality, without doubt that want was made up by some other advantage, that may make amends for the shortness of its being, maybe by an universal intellect, or a perfect knowledge of all things in their causes. And it's for that reason that the wise mover of all things hath not shaped for it organs like ours, which are proper only for a simple reasoning, not only weak, but many times fallacious too; but others more ingeniously framed, stronger, and more numerous, which serve to manage its speculative exercises. You'll ask me, perhaps, whenever any cabbage imparted those lofty conceptions to us. But tell me again, who ever discovered to us certain beings, which we allow to be above us? to whom we bear no analogy nor proportion, and whose existence it is as hard for us to comprehend as the understanding and ways whereby a cabbage expresses itself to its like, though not to us, because our senses are too dull to penetrate so far. Moses, the greatest of philosophers, who drew the knowledge of nature from the fountainhead, nature herself, hinted this truth to us when he spoke of the tree of knowledge, and without doubt he intended to intimate to us under that figure that plants, in exclusion to mankind, possess perfect philosophy. Remember then, O thou proudest of animals, that though a cabbage which thou cuttest saith not a word, yet it pays it at thinking. But the poor vegetable has no fit organs to howl as you do, nor yet to frisk it about and weep. Yet it hath those that are proper to complain of the wrong you do it, and to draw a judgment from heaven upon you for the injustice. But if you still demand of me how I come to know that cabbage and coleworts conceive such pretty thoughts, then I will ask you, how come you to know that they do not? And that some amongst them, when they shut up at night, may not compliment one another as you do, saying, Good night, Master Coal-curled Pate. Your most humble servant, good Master Cabbage Roundhead. So far was he gone on in his discourse, when the young lad, who had led out our philosopher, led him in again. What, supped already? cried my spirit to him. He answered, Yes, almost, the physiognomist having permitted him to take a little more with us. Our young landlord stayed not till I should ask him the meaning of that mystery. I perceive, said he, you wonder at this way of living. Know then, that in your world the government of health is too much neglected, and that our method is not to be despised. In all houses there is a physiognomist entertained by the public, who in some manner resembles your physicians, save that he only prescribes to the healthful, and judges of the different manners how we are to be treated only according to the proportion, figure, and symmetry of our members, by the features of the face, the complexion, the softness of the skin, the agility of the body, the sound of the voice, and the colour, strength, and hardness of the hair. Did not you just now mind a man of a pretty low stature who eyed you? He was the physiognomist of the house. Assure yourself that according as he observed your constitution, he hath diversified the exhalation of your supper. Mark the quilt on which you lie, how distant it is from our couches. Without doubt he judges your constitution to be far different from ours, since he feared that the odour which evaporates from those little pipkins that stand under our noses might reach you, or that yours might steam to us. At night you'll see him choose the flowers for your bed, with the same circumspection. End of chapter 12.